We have today Phil Elliot, which is now working with Square Enix Collective, and we will know more during this interview what is Collective about. First of all, thank you, Phil, for this interview, and I'd like to start by asking you, what was the idea behind the creation of Square Enix Collective, and if your past experiences on the video games industry somehow influence its creation?
Yeah. Do you know, actually, that second part is the first time anyone's asked me that. That definitely. So the way I got into the industry was through media, actually. I kind of stumbled into journalism, if you like, at the BBC with a radio programme. And then that was with consumer tech and with video games. And then towards the end, I did that for a couple of years. Towards the end, it was almost all video games and virtually no consumer tech. And I sort of took that as a sign that, okay, I really want to follow this passion. I've always played games. And it's pretty much of the top 10 list of hobbies I have, it fills slots 1 through 9. So I went into specialist and did some time at GameSpot. But really, it was when I was running a site called gamesindustry.biz that I really for the first time talked to a lot of developers and a lot of publishers and started to really get to grips with how things work on the business side. And so I heard all the stories about, how developers were sometimes treated. And I suppose in some ways that kind of formed my opinions about, that the ecosystem and what forms a healthy ecosystem within games. Latterly, in the past 6 or 7 years, we've seen the decline of the AA developer and the rise of the indie developer, which I think has been very exciting. But at the same time, with that excitement and the accessibility of tools, the barriers to making games have never been lower. But because of the number of games, the sheer number of games and teams making them is now so high that the barriers to actually succeeding with a release, have probably never been higher. So at Square Enix, we look to the future. It's obviously part of our responsibility because we are investing in our own big AAA games. So we need to understand what the market is going to look like in the next 3 to 5 or 10 years, or however long ahead we look. And we're always looking at business models. We're looking at genres, at platforms, and sort of trying to predict how things are going to be. As we expect these games that maybe we start now, what's the market going to be like when we want them to release? But there's another big thing which people just don't seem to talk about very often. When you hear analysts forecasting and in sort of financial calls and so on, like what happens to the creativity of the industry? How do you ensure that the landscape, the future environment of games is in a good place to encourage creativity? Because it's creativity that really underpins the success of what we do across the board. And I think while AAA is extremely exciting, it's always on the cutting edge of technology and it's pushing the boundaries there, and it's great at grabbing headlines. It's very, very expensive to make AAA games, and those budgets have increased steadily to sort of the tens of millions now. So if you're looking at an industry that relies on innovation, and when I say innovation, I don't just mean technical innovation and graphical fidelity and so on, which the video games business has always been great at pushing. I'm really now talking about diversity of emotions, of experiences, of perspectives. And we've seen the games that really strike out in that direction. Things like Papers, Please, or Dear Esther, or Gone Home, or I could name a dozen buzzword games, but they are giving us different emotion experiences, and I think that's absolutely vital for the health of the industry in the future. So we believe it's very important to support new talent. We never know now, because of the way that anyone anywhere can build a game. We have no idea where to look for the next blossoming talent to come into games. And at the same time, it's harder for bigger companies like Square Enix to build relationships with with up and coming developers, because whereas maybe 6 or 7 years ago you could probably know most dev studios heads by name. Now you're going to have a pretty big book to fit all of the micro studios in. So there's a lot of challenges in there for publishers, also for developers, and it's that kind of melee of ideas, I guess.
It's curious. You're delving into something I was going to ask you later on the interview, but I will use your cue to ask you.
Okay.
Do you think that possibly with the size of Square Enix that your developers, your internal developers might decide to start pushing some of their wildest ideas through collective?
So it's actually a tricky question to answer. I've had people ask from around the different studios, and I think in an ideal world it would be nice to be able to find some method of enabling them to kind of express their own creativity, on their own ideas and so on, and then be able to support that. And who knows, maybe we can find a way. But I think it is a little bit challenging when, their first priorities from our business side of things, in terms of the day job, really have to be with the games they're working on, because for Square Enix, that's where we're going to be earning our money. Collective is a little bit different. Mm-hmm. Any profits we make through collective, incidentally, the margins we work on for collective games are very, very slim. Mm-hmm. We try to set these agreements up in the right way, if you take my meaning. So very much loaded in favour of the developer. Any profit we do make on collective, though, we reinvest back into collective.
Yeah.
So it's kind of hard, and I suppose that sort of taps into a wider question about, collective is great in a lot of ways. It's like we try to kind of have the agility of a startup, that kind of mentality where we want to be super efficient and really cut out waste wherever possible. And we're lucky because we sort of exist within the safety net of a global corporation. I'm sure a lot of startups would love that kind of security. And we can access lots of different services like legal or QA or whatever it might be. But of course, we can't really do that if it's to the detriment of the bigger teams. And I think that's right, and I think obviously it's a sort of a business requirement. We have to prioritize the stuff which is going to give the results that Square Enix needs to keep investing in new games and so on. I don't want to be in a position where I say to a team, well, that's a great idea, so you just have to quit your day job and then you can come join Collective. I think that's probably not a good position to be in from the perspective of Square Enix. So we do encourage developers around the studios to, as their time permits, to get involved with Collective, and we have this sort of informal mentoring network. But at the moment, it's a little tricky for us to sort of see a good way where we could, maybe take internal teams under our wing. It's kind of it's just a difficult thing to say a yes or no to.
The logistics are really, really complicated.
In the same way that everything I do, I want to be responsible to the developers we work with. I also have to be responsible to the business that we sit within as well.
When you were talking about your past experience and you were talking about your beginning on BBC, you told me that you felt that the video games part of the program, the show that you had, was progressively increasing comparing to tech. Do you think that was a tendency of the market or also from the public? That's what they desired?
No, that was on me. Basically, when I was at a radio network called Radio 5 Live, which is a news and sport network, and I joined as a station sound producer. That was kind of my first career, was in audio design, but I'd done student radio at university, so I had a bit of experience in broadcasting. And really, it was a kind of a solution to a problem. Our coverage as a network of consumer tech and video game stories was abysmal / non-existent, and there was a big drive to appeal to a younger audience. So I was playing Provo soccer with the controller of 5 Live one day, and I got so annoyed at some of the coverage of I think a story about Bluetooth. I just swore very loudly, and and the controller, chap called Bob Shannon, paused the game just as I was about to score, obviously, and just kind of looked at me and said, "Is this something you need to get off your chest?" So I just explained that, if we had this ambition, then we really needed to talk in a more relevant way about things which are way more relevant to I mean, we're not talking about kids, we're talking about sort of 25 to 34-year-olds. And then a few weeks later, I found myself with my own half-hour slot on the overnight show each week. So it was a kind of funny way that it came about. The thing is, I think to sell that concept, consumer tech was an important part of that story. But really, over the course of 2.5 years that I did the show, my own.
Sorry, but that was for that time. You needed that cane to sell the show.
I think it had to be a mix of the two, and I think that the consumer tech was an important angle anyway, because it's about, I mean, the BBC is there to educate and inform. So if you're talking about, viruses or iPhones or internet security, or there's a lot of things that people should know or would do better off knowing. And then, when the Xbox 360 launched, I mean, that's obviously a consumer tech and a video game story. But I'd always try to fit in a review of a game each week. And in the end, it just, I mean, to me, I had the luxury of pretty much total autonomy on what was in the show, because I would write it, produce it, co-present it, and the rest.
The literal one-man show.
Yeah, and I just used to hook up with the kind of the sort of the overarching show presenter and so I'd kind of write his links and we'd just kind of chat, and then I'd edit it all together, and it would go out as a pre-recorded segment. So I had that luxury of being able to choose the direction and the destiny of the program, and it was really just my own personal passions kind of creeping through. So
another thing
that
curious
was on me, but I think the two do go hand in hand.
Yeah.
They're important for each other.
Another thing curious you just said, which reminded us of why Robot Chicken, the media we created and belonged to, was created, because we felt that we needed to speak to people around our age, which is 30-something, even 40-something people that grew up playing games, and they want to listen or to talk about games with a more serious tone or more complex tone than just things for kids like we used to listen to when we were little. Do you feel both, as when you were part of the media and now you're part of the actual industry, that the consumer base really grew up? It's where are the key opinion makers? For which age slot should you talk to? Who are the buyers who have that power, the power to buy and to consume?
It's an interesting question. I mean, when I was at the BBC, one of the things that I used to present the rationale for this show was, the video games portion of the show, was that the BBC did its own research and had shown that the average age of video gamers was increasing by 1 year every year. So literally every year that the audience for games would grow up, and it showed that it was very much a generational thing. But every year that the market got bigger, as almost saturation, everyone grew up with games.
Makes sense.
I've no idea what it would be today, but I think it's kind of all pervasive. I think, some people probably feel like they grow out of video games, but when I think about my contemporaries and the people I work with and my friends, there's a significant portion of them would absolutely identify themselves as core gamers. So I think the challenge there is, though, that games could be something that unites different age groups, where I think music may not in a lot of ways. I think, let's say you could be 18 years old and playing Battlefield. You could be 38 years old and playing Battlefield or World of Warcraft or whatever. You might not be 38 years old and listening to One Direction.
And if you are, it's strange. Please contact a shrink.
Live and let live, right? Everyone has their own taste. I'm not going to criticize that. But
I understand.
I have a lot of, I have a lot of gaming-related hobbies that I'm sure people would consider quite nerdy. But I think interestingly, when you look at the way people interact within games. So, obviously, we've just seen the latest expansion to World of Warcraft release, and I'm a big WoW fan. I play that game a lot, and you jump into pickup groups trying to do raids or dungeon groups or whatever, and you never know what you're going to get. You never know if you're going to get mature people or immature people, and I think by the way that people talk or behave, you can quite quickly get a sense of maybe the kind of age group that you're with there. And that's not to generalize and say that, all kind of 15-year-olds are massively immature and stay away from them. There's always a range of kind of personalities and so on. But, I see a lot of people in general chat in the game, for example, selling their guild on being mature or being serious or being for 30 plus. And, the truth is when that game came out, probably all of us were in our 20s and not in our 30s. And so the idea of advertising a guild and one of the benefits being for 30 plus people, back then it'd be like, 30 plus probably means they're just not very good at the game. Whereas now we'd probably take it to mean that we're not under so much pressure to have to be top end and, topping the DPS meters or the HPS meters or whatever. And it fits in with their lifestyle. So I think there are different markets to kind of cut short a very, very long-winded answer. And different things will appeal within those markets. I think having a show which talks more seriously and perhaps more sedately in a way about games and more, considers different things. I would love to hear more on the kind of the design philosophies about games, but I'm sure that's not going to be interesting to everybody. But the market now in terms of purchasing, I still think that obviously parents buying games for their kids is a big market.
And for themselves.
I now have kids of my own, so I know that I'm definitely contributing to that market.
For the kids and for themselves.
Yeah, for sure. But I think disposable income, tends to be higher at older ages, where people have more sort of security, financial security. And I think that, where we see collector's editions and stuff like that, I again, as I see some of my friends will not hesitate to put down a pre-order for something if it's a franchise they have a high expectation of enjoying or something they know well, whereas maybe 10 years ago they might have waited and seen what the review scores were. The whole video game industry has always been very much in flux, very fast moving, and I think that's not just about the technology we've been pinned to, but I think it's very much about the market that we are trying to appeal to as well.
You're one of the living proofs that somehow the industry is really changing on the last decade. For example, you're starting to have what you didn't have on the 90s, which was business people or people working inside the business that actually were gamers, and they grew up knowing exactly what video games are and how complex they can be. Do you think that's one of the secrets of why you could convince or could have convinced Square Enix administration to open an inside publisher just dedicated to indies?
So I think the first thing is so you're right. When the games industry was young, to have anyone with business experience come into the industry, then necessarily they wouldn't have gotten that business experience within video games. I think that, and to be honest, when I was in media and heard a lot of the horror stories about how relationships between developers and publishers broke down and so on, I think that probably comes from a lot of that. That stems from that sort of disconnect between publishers thinking more along the business and developers thinking more along the creative side. However, I do think that in the last decade, the industry has transformed, and I started to see this when I was in media. I'll be honest. Yeah, I mean, it's up to you whether or not you kind of believe me to be subjective. But I was surprised. My expectation on joining Square Enix was that it would be more populated by suits chasing dollars than by gamers just wanting to be part of making games a reality. And in fact, necessarily for a listed global corporation, of course, you've got to have people who are there to think and sort of be the stewards of the business with that kind of experience. But there's a lot of people, the vast majority of people work at Square Enix, and I can't talk for other publishers, but I'm sure it's the same, because they're there for the love of the games, whether it's in marketing, whether it's in design, whether it's in QA, or all parts of the business. They're there because it's games that they love, and constantly the talk of which Pokemon game they're playing, or which how much they're looking forward to Persona, or it's not I'm definitely not an exception, so it's very kind of you to say, but it really seems more than the normal for that kind of people are there for the games, and it's that which drives them to the video games industry. And I think also just a note on the administration, as you call it. I mean, the collective really has three stakeholders. Obviously, I'm one of them. It was ultimately kind of my idea to put these things together and build this thing called Collective, initially as an experiment, and then we sort of tested it to see how it went and evolved it over time. But the other two stakeholders are Phil Rogers, who's the CEO of the West, and Yosuke Matsuda, who's the global president of Square Enix. And both of them have been incredibly supportive, very positive about what it is we're trying to achieve, bearing in mind that we do have different objectives from the rest of the business, and they deserve a lot of the credit for that support, and obviously without that support, Collective wouldn't have been possible. So it's not the work of one person. It's definitely a team effort.
You were talking earlier about how you're projecting this difference in business between Collective and the rest of the global company, specifically to the developers. How are you working nowadays? Are you funding some of the projects you approve? Are you working only with Kickstarter or self-funded games? How is Collective working with the studios?
It's a range of things. To be honest, I want a situation where we could potentially work with anybody on anything. I don't want to have a strict set of rules where this team doesn't tick the right boxes, so therefore I'm afraid our path is not available to them. I want to try to be flexible. So for some teams, we may work with them, and they may have found funds independently, whether that's crowdfunding or through investors or through self-funding. It may be their first game, their second game, or their third game. The budget may be $100,000, it may be $500,000, or it may be more. Generally, we at this point we're not working with on teams where their budgets are more than $1 million. Because I just think that's the right place for us to be right now. But in the future, I certainly wouldn't rule out growing that. We have put money into production on some games. In those cases, it tends to be the games where we really see a spark of talent, or we really see something special. But without that investment, there's no guarantee they'll get to market. So we want to try to help those teams get their game released. And obviously then we want to try and help them sell it so that they can take all of that experience and have enough funding, independently from the proceeds of their first game to go and pour it all into their second game. Because that's how we see the industry improve. It's by gaining that experience and then moving on with it and sort of taking it on. And we see so many small teams never get that first game out the door, or maybe they do, but then they just only sell a few hundred copies and
they vanish.
Yeah, and it's too easy to say, well, if the game's good enough, it'll sell. I'm afraid that's nonsense.
That's not the only factor.
If the game is visible enough, it will sell, and whether it's good or bad. So what we want to try and do is find teams that can make good games and also help them make those games visible as well.
You just made me laugh with that last sentence about visibility and selling ability, even if the game is better, good or not. But okay, moving on.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to name any names, but we've all had and the thing is that can be subjective. I mean, what makes a good game? Your good game might be a rubbish game. And well, I don't know. I've seen some games that are bad, but I think the vast majority of people, of course, never set out to make a bad game, and that's true of big AAA studios as well. Mm-hmm. You would think sometimes when you see comments from gamers, it's like companies intentionally sort of set out to include bugs and crashes and whatever. But the thing is, it's just about finding the right audience for a game, and most indie developers, when they form their group, they've got someone who can code, they've got an artist, maybe they've got a sound person. Almost certainly they won't have anyone to think about PR or community or marketing. They won't have anyone or they may well not have anyone who is experienced on the business side. And the most they've got is kind of Steam Spy, and they'll look at comparative games and say, well, okay, that game sold 1 million units, so we'll just aim for 10% of that. We'll make loads of money. That it just doesn't tell the whole story, and so we sort of try to go around and explain a little bit more about how it works and give people the benefit of our experience. And then if it's a good fit and if we think we can make a difference to a team and help, then maybe we work with them.
Okay. How do you project Collective in like 5 years? Are you building it to be an established name as an indie publisher, like for example Devolver or Team 17, by its own name? And I'm saying this because I think the official name is Square Enix Collective. Is it?
Yeah, and
do you expect it to? When nowadays when I speak about Collective, because we know about it because of you, of course, some people really think, well, Square Enix has an indie publisher. It's still a strange thing. But you project to have Collective as a strong name. Everybody, oh, this game's from Collective. Yeah.
Kind of standalone. Well, I don't know. I mean, I think we use Collective for shorthand because Square Enix Collective is a bit of a mouthful. Yeah. And we might kind of internally, sort of bridge it down to SEC. I mean, on the 5-year thing, it's funny because when we first announced Collective back in 2013 or whenever it was now, it was very, very much experimental. We had no idea if developers would accept it, if gamers would accept it. And really, the first couple of years was very much about trying to explain to developers what we were there for and what we were trying to do. And rightly so, there was a lot of cynicism. Why is a big global publisher messing about with not just indie development but crowdfunding as well? It was almost the horror of horrors. A publisher with these giant boots, kind of trampling on everything that's good and sucking the life out of it. And that's the reaction we expected. Because publishers have this kind of historical reputation, but we knew from the start that it would always have to be around proof. We would have to prove our intentions over time, and that we hoped we could give developers enough success and enough support that people would sort of see behind those easy assumptions. So there was, for the longest time, I didn't really plan for more than 3 or 6 months at a time. And it was only really when we sort of signed our first game that I thought, well, okay, now we're definitely here for the next 2 years at least. So when you say, what are you planning for the next 5 years, or what do you see Collective being? It's a funny thing because I'm so not used to really thinking in concrete terms that far ahead. But our aim is to be publishing up to 10 games a year. We want to be supporting sort of 7 or 8, maybe more projects through Kickstarter every year, and we want to continue the feedback platform. Ultimately, we want to grow Collective's awareness among gamers because that will ultimately bring more benefit to developers. to their games. If more people are aware of what we're doing, then it means we can hopefully sell more games, and the developers will make more money. For us, the deals are structured where there's a relatively low risk on our part. We put money into marketing or development, but it's not, we don't have to sell a ridiculous number of units to break even.
Yeah.
Beyond that, actually making a profit on these things once we break even is much harder for us, and I think that's right. The developers are then the vast beneficiaries of their hard work. So we'll see. I don't know. 5 years is a very long time in the video games business. If I think back to what we were talking about 5 years ago, then we were probably talking about the success of the App Store, and Zynga was probably the golden child of the games business in terms of financial revenue. So a lot changes. But for me, anything can change about Collective really, except for that core philosophy, which is that we're here to actually be a beneficial part of the industry. We're not here to try and suck revenues and life and ideas and IP out of developers. We're actually here to enrich and to enhance their chances of survival, and hopefully to help them secure their futures and build up their own IP. We never take IP from developers, even if we put the majority of the budget into production on the game. So we're trying to build sustainable businesses that can then go on and flourish and thrive independently. And I say independently because, again, we're never locking people into working with us after the particular project they've signed with us on.
Okay. And the last question I would like to ask you, do you think that projects like Collective are one way of gigantic global companies to be able to experiment artistically and creatively, and in extent to increase their own market reach?
I think it's definitely a good way to learn. My personal view is that the games, the budget ranges that we see games coming through at Collective, which can be anything from sort of $100,000 upwards to maybe at the moment $1 million. But I think anything up to that $2.5 million budget range, I think this could be one of the biggest growth opportunities for the industry.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, and given that I think that, then obviously Collective being a part of that, I would have to say it's smart, wouldn't I? Because otherwise I'd be criticising myself. But I think there are ground rules to working with teams at this level, and we look at EA announcing EA Originals, and from what I gather of that platform, I think they have some terrific ground rules in place as well. I don't know how they handle IP, but certainly, the way that they've worked so far and everything they've said seems positive in terms of supporting this. If we can call it the new talent coming into the business. So I think different businesses will look on it and will probably have different priorities, different intentions. I can't speak for those, but for me, I think if other companies are coming in and doing something similar, different but with the similar intentions, I think that's very good news for the business. For us, it's very important not to actually be competitive with the likes of, you mentioned, Team 17 and Devolver. We don't want to be a threat to their business. There are plenty of very promising developers and projects to go around. To be completely honest with you, there are times when I've made introductions to other publishers because I've actually felt that another publisher would do a better job than Collective at that point. So I think those sort of specialist indie publishers are a very important part of the industry ecosystem. But I think for big companies, I don't know. As I say, it comes down to their intentions. If they're looking to harvest IP, then maybe it's an easy route, but who knows? I think for us, we might find, here's an example of where we've, as Square Enix as a wider business, I think has got some interesting benefits maybe from Collective. The first game that we published was Goetia, and as part of Collective, we've been making available some of our old legacy IPs. That team called Sushi, based in France, pitched internally to us to make a Fear Effect game, And because we'd built a relationship with that team, then we were comfortable about working with them on that. And they went out and we supported them, raising money through Kickstarter. They added their own funds to that, and they're building a new Fear Effect game. I mean, for us, throwing out that old IP isn't really about trying to find other teams to take risk on reinvigorating stuff for us. But where we see it can be a
win-win situation.
Yeah, where teams can maybe make more of a name for themselves by working on something that's recognised, then
and
that's
they really love
support it. Yeah, right. And but I think that's good. For us, it's I mean, of course we'll look to make a license fee from that game. Again, the deals are structured that the developers are the primary risk takers, so they should be the primary beneficiaries. But it adds an interesting, I think, element to our business. I think it gives us more options overall, and generally I tend to think that more options are better than fewer. So yeah, but I don't know. I mean, it's hard to predict what material benefits. I mean, I think if a publisher goes in expecting to make millions off indie games, then
he's wrong.
It's not impossible. I mean, you could pick up a fledgling Microsoft, I guess, and maybe even make billions, but
yeah,
it's unlikely. And I think that
it's a chance.
Yeah. I mean, for us, we candidly, I think that the profit that we'd make on each game would sort of resemble a pancake. But if we do 10 of those over a year, then it maybe does start to get more interesting.
Yeah.
When I say more interesting, again, it's not like we're thinking of funding the next Tomb Raider or Final Fantasy from collective profits. Mm-hmm. The profits we make on collective we put back in to invest in more games and help more teams, and sponsor game jams or dev conferences to try to do what we can. And trust me, I've got no shortage of interesting and cool ways that I would happily spend Square Enix's money on supporting all that stuff. But as I say, I have to be responsible to the business. So we'll wait and see, what money we can make from it first before I start spending it on that. But the priority really, as I say, is about trying to help developers become sustainable businesses. So anything else after that is an added bonus.
Okay. Phil, thank you for this interview. We wish you the very best to Collective. We think it's an awesome project, a courageous project. And I felt bad for using the word courage after Apple, but take it with the best of intentions.
Yeah, no, it's very kind. And
really, thank you for this interview. I hope we will talk again in the near future.
Yeah, anytime. Just I mean, how to get hold of me. So if you ever have any questions or ever want to talk to any of the developers or whatever might be interesting, then please feel free to get in touch.